I want to talk for just a minute about how to find the balance between the amount of time that you're spending working on new questions, meaning answering questions that you haven't done before, taking new practice tests, things like that, versus how much time you should be spending reviewing questions that you've already done, be that on test review, section review, or going back and redoing tests that you might have done weeks or even months earlier. Now, this is actually something where there's not one set answer because the balance changes over time, and what that changes with is how well you're scoring. Essentially, when you are starting out, you're going to be missing a lot of questions, and so the majority of your time is going to be spent in reviewing those things and making sure that you're learning the skills to be able to answer those questions correctly the next time you see something like those. And so we're not going to talk about stuff in the really low scores, but below, we'll say below the high 150s. So everything up through about the high 150s, the vast majority of people are going to spend their time effectively when they're only doing about 30 to 40% of your total study time working on new questions and 60 to 70% of your time on review. Now, part of that is that you're missing quite a few questions at that point. Typically, the high 150s, that's going to be right around that 60 to 68%, or not 68, 60 to 65% range at the highest. And so you're still missing a lot of questions, and it's going to be in taking the time to go back over those questions, really making sure that you understand them, redo them a couple of times, that you're going to see the best improvement. And so you really want to be spending the bulk of your time there. Now, once you break into those high 150s, crack into the 160 range, now you're going to want to split your time about 40 to 50% on new and 50 to 60% on review. And that's because it's going to take you a little less time to review. You're obviously getting a lot more questions right and much higher percentage. And so it's going to take you less time to make sure that you're fixing all of the reasoning errors or problems that you might have seen in the questions that you've been doing already. For the most part, people, once they get into the high 160s, now you're really going to be spending the bulk of your time on new questions. So 60 to 70% of your time on new questions, 30 to 40% on review. And that's because once you get into that range, you're not missing very many questions. On the classic scoring scale, that's out of 100, you're usually looking at about a 90-ish%, around that 170 mark. And so on a given test, you're only missing about 10, maybe 12 questions. And that's going to take a lot less time to review than it would when you were missing, 35. So that's where a lot of those differences are going to come. It also takes you a little bit less time to review because you're able to see the patterns maybe a little faster, and so people are able to get through that more. So that's kind of a good gauge. Now, oftentimes people ask the question of how many practice tests should I be taking as well? And that is largely a function of how much time you have. My general thing is, assuming that you have between maybe 10 and 20 hours to study, one test a week if you're below the mid to high 150s, 2 tests a week when you get into the 160 range, and bump that up to about 3 tests a week when you get into the 170 range. But I would almost never go above that. And I know that there's people who say, oh, take a test every day. There's quite a bit of data that shows that a lot of times people end up scoring worse on their actual test when they try to do that. There are anecdotal situations where people are like, yeah, I did that, it worked great, but overall, as far as sort of data, testing every day is not correlated with good performance in the actual exam. And I think that there's some reasons for that. But so this gives you kind of a general breakdown. Below the high 150s, 30 to 40% new, which is a lot less than what most people think. A lot of people think they should just be answering a lot of new questions, but that's not really going to help your skill set. And then once you get into the high 160s, 170s, now you're down to about 60 to 70% new. But notice you're still spending 30 to 40% of your time reviewing, and that's so that you're making sure that you weed out those last few little questions that are giving you trouble. So there's your study tip for the week.